Scripture reading is from chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, starting with the 5th verse. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he didn't see death, and he wasn't found because God took him up. He was given approval for having pleased God before he was taken up. It's impossible to please God without faith, because the one who draws near to God must believe that God exists and that he rewards people who try to find him. By faith, Noah responded with godly fear when he was warned about events he hadn't yet seen. He built an ark to deliver his household. With his faith, he criticized the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes from faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that was going to receive an inheritance. He went out without knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived in the land he had been promised as a stranger. He lived in tents along with Isaac and Jacob, who were co-heirs of the same promise. He was looking forward to a city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah received the ability to have a child, though she herself was barren and past the age for having children, because she believed the one who promised was faithful. So descendants were born from one man, and he was good as dead. They were as many as the number of the stars in the sky and as countless as the grains of sand on the seashore. All of these people died in faith without receiving the promise. But they saw the promises from a distance and welcomed them. They confessed that they were strangers, that they were immigrants on earth. People who say this kind of thing make it clear that they are looking for a homeland. If they had been thinking about the country that they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return to it. But at this point in time, they are longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God isn't ashamed to be called their God. By faith, Abraham offered Isaac when he was tested. The one who received the promises was offering his only son. He had been told concerning him, "Your legitimate descendants will come from Isaac." Abraham figured that God could raise even him from the dead. So in a way, he did receive him. He received him back from the dead. By faith, Isaac also blessed Jacob and Esau concerning their future. By faith, Jacob blessed each of Joseph's sons as he was dying and bowed in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph recalled the exodus of the Israelites at the end of his life and gave instructions. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months when he was born because they saw that the child was beautiful and they weren't afraid. By faith, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter when he grew up. He chose to be mistreated with God's people instead of having temporary pleasure. He thought the abuses he suffered for Christ was more valuable than the treasures of Egypt. By faith, he left Egypt without being afraid. He kept going because he could see what is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood in order that the destroyer could not touch their children. By faith, they crossed the Red Sea as if they were on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried it, they were drowned. By faith, Jericho's walls fell after the people marched around them for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute was not killed with the disobedient. What more can I say? I would run out of time if I told you about Gideon and Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Through faith, they conquered kingdoms. They brought about justice. They realized promises. They shut the mouth of lions. They put out raging fires. They escaped from the edge of the sword. They found strength in weakness, were mighty in war, and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured and refused to be released so they could gain a better resurrection. Others experienced public shame by being taunted. They were even put in chains and in prison. They were stoned to death. They were cut in two, and they died by being murdered with swords. They went around wearing the skins of sheep and goats, needy, oppressed, mistreated. The world did not deserve them. They wandered around in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. All these people did not receive what was promised, though they were given approval for their faith. God provided something better. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Will you pray with me? God, we come to this holy place, this holy time, this holy moment, and we ask for your words to fill us up, to open up our hearts and our minds, our ears and our hands. Fill us up and send us out. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be yours, holy God. Amen. So my great-great-grandfather Haley arrived in America via a pickle barrel. He was the latest in a long line of ancestors in our family that were always on the wrong side of a war. My brother once did a really interesting history paper on how our family descended from a very long line of losers. We were like Lieutenant Dan, from Forrest Gump, who was from a long line of people who were killed in war. Except our family didn't die so much as just run away as fast as possible. I could tell you stories about my great-great-uncle, Jeb Stewart, who was found wandering the fields of Pennsylvania rather being than where he was supposed to be at the time. But my great-great-grandfather, Haley, was the last descendant of a minor royal house in the North Rhineland, which, if you are a history or geography buff, will recognize as that part of France and Germany that they keep arguing about. There were a couple world wars, in fact, fought over this little strip of land. That's where my family is from. And when the German Revolution happened, he decided that it was not a good place for him to be a minor royal nobility in anymore. And so he left. He decided it would be better for him to enter into a conspiracy whereby he and a friend emptied out a pickle barrel that was destined for America. They rolled him into it, sealed him up, and closed it up. And for 24 hours, he lived in a pickle barrel in the bottom of a boat as they crossed the ocean. I guess at some point they popped the lid off and he got out and wandered around like he was always supposed to be on the boat. Because for the next 2 weeks, he wandered around the boat as they crossed the ocean. And after a series of misadventures, he ended up in Chicago selling wagon wheels. Or that's how the story is told in my family. Now, as a child, I always imagined the pickle barrel was still full of pickles. And so he was sitting amongst the bags of pickles, but it had to have been empty, right? These stories are told to reveal an inner truth, some sort of secret revelation about your family. It always seemed to come up quite frequently in our family when I was complaining. When my parents had asked me to take out the trash or some equally gross chore, my mom would say, "At least you don't have to sneak out of Germany in a pickle barrel." Which, fair enough, that's hard to argue with. But we all are a collection of stories and legacies, and some of them are more true than others, or maybe I should say less factual than others. But they all contain truth. We find ourselves in Hebrews reading through what is essentially an annotated bibliography of genealogies. You know, those annoying pieces of work that your professor would make you do to prove that you'd actually read the research that you said you did on your paper. The Old Testament, to which the author of the Hebrews is so reverent, is chock full of genealogies. Who they are and where they come from is important. The Old Testament authors seem to think it's incredibly important that you know who begat who and why and when, and exactly how many generations exist between the one person they were talking about and the next great hero or villain of the story, and the new character they are about to be in this. So throughout the Old Testament, authors tend to assume that you know the backstory of these people that they're naming. The author of Hebrews does not make this assumption. The author of Hebrews instead imagines that you only know the Instagram version of these people's stories. the short, glossy version of their story, the not quite true version of their story. And so the author goes to the trouble to explain how and why each person is included, why they are valuable and important part. Many of these names are familiar to us: Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Jacob. They are familiar ones to us. Others might be more obscure. The first one we read, Enoch, is not one of the great heroes we teach our children about. He named people like Gideon and Barak and Jephthah and Samson. Some are well known, some are obscure, but each person's example is supposed to tell us about an ancient truth, about faith, about what it means to live a life of faith, what it means to be people who find themselves in the midst of something. It's to remind us that we are not alone. We are not alone in our struggles. In fact, in the light of these stories that the author lifts up, the hearers don't even have particularly unique or interesting struggles. Look, he says, look at Abraham, who wandered the desert and never found a place to lay his head until he was buried with his wife Sarah in a borrowed cave. He lived into a promise which he never saw with his own eyes. This should remind you of stories from Jesus' life. When one night when he was sitting with his friends during a dark night of the soul, he shared that a prophet of God can never return home and never has a place to lay his head. Like Abraham, Jesus is buried in a borrowed tomb. And he did not see with his human eyes the fulfillment of the promise. It took resurrection. It took resurrection to reveal that final promise that had begun in Abraham, to reveal the final truth and complete the story of all of those generations that had been centuries earlier. The promise of Abraham was not fulfilled until Jesus died and resurrected. That is when Abraham's descendants numbered the skies and were like grains of sand, because all people were welcomed into the family of God. We could go through each of the stories that were presented and draw similar parallels between what the people who were living in the Old Testament experienced and what the folks who were listening to Hebrews were living through at the time. We could go through each of the stories presented and see the similarities between what the folks in the Old Testament went through and the folks in the Hebrews, time of the Hebrews, and the folks today are experiencing. The challenges are the same. These are all stories about how to live into the promise of the first 4 verses in this chapter. If the Christian life is about faithing our way into hope, even when hope doesn't appear to be found before our eyes, maybe especially when hope is not nearby, maybe especially when hope feels distant and the promise seems dim, then the author seems to say, here's an example of how these people lived through it. I always begin our very first session of youth group every year by saying out loud to our young people, there is nothing that you can do, there is nothing you can say, there is nothing you can share with me that will make you less in my eyes or in the eyes of God. There is nothing that you can say, there is nothing that you can do which hasn't been done before, or which I haven't done, or which someone hasn't told me a story about already. This is a safe place for you because you are not doing anything new or different. Now, some of my youth have taken that as a challenge to try to be more creative than their previous youth group friends. But most have heard what the truth is. You are not alone. This is not a new problem. You are not experiencing anything that is wholly unique to you. People have been there and done that, and guess what? You're going to be okay. It's going to be okay. I could tell you some stories. I could tell you some stories of stupid things that people have done and brave things that people have done. I could tell you stories about youth group members who texted me at lunchtime to argue over the Bible with their friends. I could tell you stories about youth group members who were not where their parents thought they were. I could tell you stories. The stories are what make us. One of the current recurring themes of youth is a belief in the freshness and newness of their experiences. And while some of the challenges are new in shape, they are not new in essence. They're new in how they present to each generation, but the truth is the core of the problem is likely as old as Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Young people believe they've invented a brand new solution sometimes to an ancient problem, as if they're the only generation to ever face such a time as the one they are living through. Social media and late-night group texting may be a new variation, but it's an old problem. You can ask my grandmother about the party line phone she grew up on. That means there was one phone for the entire neighborhood. Everybody had one phone line, which means everybody in town could literally pick up the phone and hear whatever you were talking about. Everybody knew what you were doing. Ask Steve Hill sometime about the pictures in his museum of all the old folks sitting at the courthouse and watching everybody go by in downtown Statesville. I bet you they knew everything that everybody was doing in town. Or if you grew up in a town of literally 100 people and you didn't have TV or the internet, everyone in your world knew what you were doing. But we have a way of judging kids these days. We kids these days them to death as if we didn't walk down the same paths as they did, as if we didn't make the same silly mistakes that they're going to make. And though I've officially reached the age where young people are starting to wear the clothes I wore in high school, except they're doing it ironically, it's not that different. I walked around last year and watched people wearing matching tracksuits, you know, the hot pink ones, because they came out in the Barbie movie. And I kid you not, I have like 20 pictures of me as an 8-year-old in the exact same outfit everybody was wearing last year. There is nothing new. There is not a thing that is new under the sun, except maybe the method and the spin that we put onto it. The essence and core of life has been the same since the sun came up the first time. And to be fair, it's not like adults are better. Each age and stage comes with predictable and clockwork-like challenges. All of us experience aging parents. All of us experience aging spouses. All of us experience aging faces in our own mirrors. And none of those things are unique to you. They may have your own variation, but the stories rhyme. Alzheimer's and dementia wasn't invented in the 21st century. Neither was economic recessions. Ask about poor Mrs. Havisham, who was shut up in her attic by Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre during the turn of the 19th century. Ask your grandparents about economic uncertainty. They might know a little something about washing out bags and reusing them. They might have wisdom to share. We all walk around thinking we're all alone. Students, I've got a secret. Are you ready? Are you ready? Your teachers are just as nervous as you are. Your parents are just as nervous as you are. They know what it's like to start school. They know that tomorrow is also your teacher's first day back in the classroom. Some of them, like Mr. Jeremy, are in entirely new buildings. Some of them are not next door to their best friends anymore. Does that sound familiar? We are more allies than we are enemies. We are more on similar paths than opposite ones. And yet we always think we're the only ones that have ever felt this way. I'm the first person to ever feel like this, but we are not. It is a tale as old as time, to quote Mrs. Potts. There is nothing new. One of the reasons being part of an ancient religion is so awesome is because it brings us the comfort and security of knowing that we are not the first to deal with whatever challenges this day brings. Henry VIII literally went around England burning down churches and closing monasteries. And last time I checked, you can get a visit over to England and walk around those buildings, and people are still worshiping in them. China has banned all churches except for the state ones. So has Russia. And yet there are still people meeting who have deep faith in underground churches. People who seek a deep and faithful connection to God, which is separate from the arm of the power of the state. And those aren't even the first people to deal with those problems. Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem that had been gutted and destroyed by the Babylonians, and the first thing he did was to set about restoring the temple so people could have a place to worship. The prophet Elijah was literally chased in the desert by the king and the queen because he challenged their co-opting of God. We affirm regularly our belief in the endurance of people of God. We talk about the communion of the saints, and we talk about the holy universal church. And there's nothing that we face as an individual or as a congregation of God which has not been faced before. There's nothing that we face that God has not overcome, which God has not conquered. There is nothing of which the church, if you mean the people who are calling and gathered as people of God, have not been victorious before. Expressions of the church may change. The shape and technology of the church may change, but the Church of Christ is not bound by our limited ability to see the promise of God which is coming. It's not limited to our shaky hold on the hope that we do not always feel. The future has within it a promise that we will not see with our own eyes. The future is a promise. And believe it or not, that is the good news. That God's promise is beyond our understanding, beyond our reach, beyond our ability to grasp it and to hold on to it. It's beyond our ability to shape it into what we think it should be. God's promise is beyond our experiences. Abraham stepped out into faith, into a promise that he never saw. Abraham stepped out into faith into a promise he never saw. He raised his children into a place where they did not see the promises that Abraham was supposed to receive. Their children's children did not see it. And when my ancestor climbed into that pickle barrel, there was no guarantee he would make it. He knew that there was a new world with a promise that was beyond what he had known before. He knew there were stories that he had heard that made it possible for him to do something else. But there is nothing new for God. God told us the stories. God gave us this handy book of stories of people who have been through whatever it is that you're dealing with this morning. It's in there, I promise you. There is somebody in this book who has gone through whatever you are experiencing today, and we are not alone and never have been. We are not the first to struggle, the first to wrestle. We are not the first to discover God's promises. You are not the first. So whatever is bringing you worry, whatever is bringing you doubt, whatever is bringing you fear, whether you have joy and fulfillment and hope in your life, whatever your path is today, somebody has walked down that path before you. It's shining a light on the stones behind them so that you can come too. Thanks be to God, because that is what hope looks like. That is the promise of God. You are not alone. God has been there before. Amen.